Good evening all, and welcome. For those of you who have never been on my pop base before, now might be the time to check it out. We have loads of fun content here, all made by me. We have pops, which are a bit like tweets, where you can interact with me. We have loads of games, quizzes, and all kinds of creepy and entertaining stuff just waiting for you. It took a lot of time to make all this content, and I think it's something that you guys would really enjoy. Anyway, the reason I'm letting you guys know if you haven't seen it already, not only is it a fun place to interact with virtual me, but because in a few days' time, we are launching a competition to win a Nintendo Wii U, which I think is really, really fun. So if you guys are interested in winning it, tune in on the 18th, so the video in 3 days' time, and you could be in for a chance to win. So keep that in mind. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My family has a cabin in British Columbia that was built by my great-grandparents. We use it as a vacation spot every summer since that side of my family is huge. We always have to coordinate with everyone to pick who gets which weeks. One summer, about 9 years ago, my uncle had a new girlfriend, who later became my favourite aunt, Kerry. We decided to all sort of convoy out together, and around 8 PM we all pulled up to the cabin. It was starting to get dark, and there was a heavy feeling in the air that evening. I figured we were all just beat from the 9-hour drive that day. All of us started pulling the suitcases and coolers out of the trucks and putting them on the front deck. Kerry, being the new person in the family, wanted to help out to make a good first impression. So she started bringing everything inside for us by herself. She disappeared into the cabin for several minutes and came back out with a strange look on her face. She walked up to Nana and said something about another relative still being there, and that she thought our group was the only one booked that week. My grandpa has a sketchy homeless/addict sister who frequently squats in the cabin when people aren't there. So of course she gets irritated and calls out my grandpa, "For Christ's sake, Bill, Kerry says Sylvia is here." But immediately Kerry says that she didn't think it would be Grandpa's sister unless she happened to be about 20-ish years older than him. At this point, my Nana is plain confused and decides to go in to see who it is. I trail her, being a nosy kid, and she looks upstairs and I take the main floor, and I run into my uncle who was using the bathroom. Kerry walks inside and he says he heard her talking to someone a minute ago, and asks who it was. "Oh, I ran into a woman in that bedroom when I came in. I just said hi to her." And she points to the bedroom that used to belong to my great-grandmother before she passed. Still, at this point, none of us had clued in on what had happened until my Nana came back downstairs to tell us no one was here. I started to feel creeped out, and I can see that Kerry and my uncle are as well. We resume our unpacking, and Kerry starts to carry her things upstairs, but stops on the stairwell and drops her bags. My uncle asks if she's okay, and she can barely get a word out. She points to a picture we have on the stair landing and says, "That's her. That's the woman I saw." The picture was of my great-grandparents, and it had a small plaque at the bottom with their names. Of course, my uncle is a skeptic, and immediately says, "Nice try, but no way. That's my Grandma May. She died like 6 years ago." Kerry looked at him and me and my Nana, and I will never forget the look on her face. It was such an intense look of shock and sadness, a look that made my uncle, Nana and I all believe her. She told us that she swore she came in to bring my Nana's things into the bedroom and saw an old woman standing by the window. She apologized for barging in, and that it was nice to meet her, and then the woman smiled before turning back to the window. She even described what she was wearing, a green velvet material sweater with beadwork in the shape of a daisy in the front, my great-grandma's favourite sweater, and we all got chills and told everyone else what was happening. My grandpa is a stern, bull-headed man who refuses to believe in anything slightly abnormal, yet even he seemed creeped out upon hearing that my aunt had apparently just seen his mother. My aunt is far from the only person in our family who has seen or heard something like that in that room. Even I had a similar experience. Late one night, everyone was out having a fire in the backyard, and I ran inside to get marshmallows. You have to pass that bedroom to get to the kitchen from the back door, and as I did, I distinctly heard a conversation happening in the room. As I mentioned before, everyone was still outside. The closer I got to the door, the quieter the talking got, until it faded away. This was after the incident with Kerry, so I just poked my head around and said, "Good night, Nana May," and found the marshmallows and went back outside. The tales I have to tell about that cabin could fill a book, most of them not nearly as light-hearted or happy as the spirit of our Nana May popping in every now and then. Maybe I'll share more another day. My uncle had just gotten married, and he and his wife and her daughter had gone to Big Bear as a sort of honeymoon trip. He rented a cabin in a nice area near the lake. They had all settled in and had a nice day at the lake, came inside, had dinner, and after some TV time around 8ish, his wife and her daughter went to bed. It was a small one-bedroom cabin, so the layout was like one small hallway that led out to the back of the cabin, where the entrance to the bedroom was across, and a ways up was the bathroom. So the bathroom and the bedroom don't look into one another. You would cross the bathroom entrance before reaching the bedroom if you were going down the hall from the living room/kitchen area. The living room and kitchen were one big room at the front of the cabin. My uncle had stayed up to watch TV, and an hour or so passes by and he has to pee. So he goes into the bathroom and doesn't bother closing the door because no one was up there anyway, and proceeds to do his business. As he's doing so, he sees his wife pass by the doorway on her way towards the living room/kitchen area. He finishes up, heads into the hallway to catch up with her, and sees her at the end of the hallway. He was about to say something when she kind of half turns towards the kitchen, and suddenly flies into the kitchen at breakneck speed, making no noise, and disappears. He runs down the hall, which is only really a few steps into the dark room, lit only by the TV still on, and no one's there. No lights are on, no one's in the kitchen at this point, and he was pretty unnerved, so he goes back down the hallway and looks into the room to see his wife and daughter 100% asleep and undisturbed in bed. He realized that the woman he saw wore a knee-length white sleeping gown, while his wife was wearing pajamas. So he has no idea who it was that he saw walk past him in the restroom, or who it was that flew unnaturally into the kitchen. He was scared, but saw no reason to wake up his wife or kid. But he didn't want to go to bed, so as soon as they woke up, they packed up and left before he told them what he had seen. Later on, he called up the owner of the cabin and asked him if anything weird had happened up in the cabin. The guy went, "Oh, you saw her?" He hadn't told the guy that he had seen a woman at this point, only that he was wondering if anything odd had been reported in the cabin prior. I was walking home from school as a young teenager/preteen along a rural, heavily wooded road, and I passed one of two dilapidated hunting cabins visible from the roadside. They hadn't been used since the early 20th century, save as popular locations for kids to explore. I saw a group of 3 kids who looked slightly older than me, and who were dressed in what struck me as strangely formal fashion. I distinctly remember a red bow tie, and all 3 were in dress shirts and a dress blouse. 2 boys and 1 girl. I watched them walk into the cabin. The boys appeared to be goading the girl in. She was playful, resisting and giggling, and they didn't seem particularly sinister. But I was curious as I didn't know them, and there weren't a lot of kids in the general vicinity of where I lived. So I went up to the cabin. I couldn't have arrived more than 30 seconds after they did, including a brief, "Is this creepy of me?" kind of pause. When I look inside, the place was empty. It had a single room, no closet space, and no furniture to hide in. There were old bed springs, but the fabric had long rotted away. There was no attic or basement area. I'd seen the space under the cabin before. There was no exit, except for a high window which was narrow, and I seriously doubt the 3 of them could have fit there, let alone in that span of time. I wrote this off at the time as my mind playing tricks on me. Sometime later, I would come to learn about the 3 kids who had, decades earlier, lived in the area. 2 boys and a girl. They were known to have spent a long time exploring the old cabins, family graveyards, and Indian caves that were dotted in the local woods. One day the girl vanished after telling a friend that she was going off on one such mini adventure. Both boys swore up and down that they had not met up with her on that day. Her disappearance was never solved, and I'm 100% certain that I was not aware of this story at the time when I witnessed the vanishing teenagers. This is my uncle's story. He lives in West Virginia, one of the more remote states in the eastern United States. While his main house is in town, he also has a small cabin up on Spruce Knob, where he and my aunt would go during the summers. This cabin is very remote and accessed only by jeep trails and isn't connected to the electrical grid. So my aunt and uncle decide to take advantage of a 3-day weekend sometime in the late 80s and headed out to the cabin for some fly fishing and relaxation in the woods. When they arrived, my aunt went out to sketch some, while my uncle unpacked and built a fire in the fireplace, as it was already getting dark. As night became fall, my uncle noted how unusually quiet the woods were. He'd been camping, canoeing, and backpacking all over the world, and he still says that this is the quietest he'd ever heard them. He and my aunt packed everything up and went to bed late. Sometime around midnight, my uncle awoke to a strange thumping and scratching noise coming from outside. He thought it was probably a bear or coyote trying to get at the dog, and he grabbed his .444 Marlin to go deal with it. As he pulled the gun out from its case, the door to the outside swung open, and a large hairy shape that was vaguely humanoid appeared silhouetted in the moonlight. He said he never got quite a good look at it, but the one thing he really remembers is the overpowering smell, a stench of decay and 2 glowing red-yellow eyes. He quickly emptied the .444, and while he didn't get a kill shot, he did scratch the beast's arm, which caused it to run squealing into the woods. He and my aunt immediately grabbed their things, got in their Bronco, and hightailed it out of there. Whatever my uncle saw never really bothered them again, and when he returned in the morning with more people and more firepower, he found little evidence of any intrusion, except for a single strange clawed footprint in the front of the cabin and claw marks on the door. I don't know whether to believe my uncle or not, as he's known for telling tall tales. However, unlike his other stories, he was completely serious when he told this one, and my aunt backed him up. This story has always deeply disturbed me, as I too spend a lot of time in the woods, and I will be making a trip up to their cabin this summer, so perhaps I will see this strange beast too. This particular event happened to me when I was around 10 or 11. I had been visiting my grandpa's cabin in Big Bear Lake several times a year ever since I was a child. This isn't the first paranormal event I've experienced there, but it is definitely the most memorable. A little backstory. My grandma's cabin sits at the end of a cul-de-sac, right at the end of a vast, mostly unpopulated, aside from a few other cabins, stretch of forest. No matter what I do or how I'm feeling, I always have a very strong sensation that I'm being watched when I'm in many of the rooms of the cabin alone, day or night. I've seen shadow creatures many times in this cabin. I've heard strange knocking, whispering, and just generally feel like there's something else there with us. My grandma has told me of similar experiences and has warned me before that if I ever get a strange feeling when I'm walking into the forest, to go home immediately. But she never elaborated. Anyway, me and my dad and my uncle were walking on a trail that we've been on hundreds of times before, when we reach the first peak of a hill that we usually like to stop and look out at the view from. My dad and uncle wanted to keep hiking for a bit, but I decided to go back to the cabin on my own, as it was only 5 to 10 minutes away. I head down the usual path that I go on, and I'm not thinking too much about it when I realize that I have no idea where I am. Everything looked the same as usual, but something was wrong. The normal path was different in a way that I can't explain. It seemed to be 10 times as long as usual, and everything was silent, and there was absolutely no wildlife around me, not even a squirrel. I kept having all of these morbid thoughts coming into my head about how I was lost forever, or how some sort of creature was going to swoop in on me. Every 10 minutes or so, I'd end up at part of the trail that I definitely recognized, only to be in a completely alien area moments later. The path kept winding and winding downhill, and the sun was setting pretty rapidly. I had to have been walking in the direction of the cabin for more than an hour, because I remember I was checking my watch and panicking. At this point, I just accepted that I was lost. I finally made it down to the street and was relieved to be able to orient myself. But I was only one street away from the cabin, although I should have been much further. I was expecting my father and uncle to be home by now, and for my parents to be worried about me being gone so long. But instead, my mother asked me why I came back so soon. I asked how long they'd been out there for, and my mother said that we'd only walked about 15 minutes longer from where I'd left them. I don't know if I'm reading into this too much, and if I was just a kid with different perceptions, but something felt very off about the whole ordeal. About 10 years ago, a friend of mine and I were browsing the interwebs in the living room of a house my father built here on the coast of North Carolina. The setup is a shotgun house, with a lot of the open space on one end, and the living room occupies the same area as the dining/kitchen. While my friend is hogging the computer, messing around with my mum's Windows XP settings more than likely. Nothing was particularly out of place and I was feeling bored. I looked at the entryway to the hall/kitchen. Then suddenly and soundlessly, a 7-foot-tall person walks into view. I'm fixated on it, as there hadn't been anything I had ever seen quite like it. There was a sense of masculinity to its shape, but overall its features were blurred by a shadowy kind of semi-static. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and it was dark anyway, so I thought maybe my eyes weren't focused and that this was someone who had broken in. It turned its face to me. I shifted in my chair and could do little else before it did the strangest thing. I felt like it focused on me in that moment and did this kind of single or half jumping jack with all its limbs spread out. My visual perception of it inverted, and the area it occupied became 100% see-through, and I could see my kitchen through it. But everything else became an opaque, staticky rainbow of colors emitting from its form. I felt a surge of adrenaline through my system, and all my hairs stood on end as the image faded from my vision. I was immobilized, with my attempting to comprehend what had happened in less than 10 seconds. I was stuck with my first rationalization. Intruder. I ran into the kitchen and grabbed a long, thick blade, running through the house, checking every closet corner and behind every door while my puzzled friend watched. I asked if he had seen anything, recanting my brief experience. He gave me a funny look, and we went back to the computer after I finished my sweep. I was on edge, but nothing else happened. I have long since looked up information on what it could have been, and about the history of our property. As far as I can tell, most of our place had been used as trash burning spots for a cabin that had long since been torn down, and other houses built over it. The best I can figure, if it wasn't just my imagination, it's likely something like a shadow person. But then again, I don't know. What do you guys think? So I figured I'd share my experience living in a 200-year-old cabin. All these things happened over the span of the 3 years that I lived there, in the beginning of 2012. A childhood friend of mine from years back asked me if I would be her roommate. I needed out of my parents' house, and she needed a roommate, so it seemed like a good situation. Now for the house. Nestled in a suburban area was this cabin. The cabin dates back to sometime in the 1700s. The road the cabin is off of bears the same name as the original family of the house. They owned a large portion of the land that is now one of the largest cities in the US. Search American colonial cabin, and you'll see a swath of images that look like it. We originally think it used to be slave quarters, as this is tobacco country, and then we later found out it was a stable house. The stable house theory checks out, as our dog dug up a horseshoe once. I still have that horseshoe. Anyway, the night we moved in, I knew the place was eerie. No doors to the upstairs, which was my room, and no doors to the downstairs bedroom. Her bedroom was an addition that someone added in the 80s. The previous owners also added a much-needed kitchen and bathroom, as the original layout did not have either. Now that you've got a decent imagery of what I was working with, I'll start with why I'm sharing this. So, when moving in, I immediately felt a feeling of being watched. The house always felt dark, cold and moist, much like a cellar. It started with scratching. Every night I would be in bed, and I would wake up to this scratching directly underneath my bed by my head. At first I thought it was mice, but when I listened to it long enough I realized that the scratching was just a long draw, like a foot-long pull, then repeated. I just recovered my head, muffled my ears and closed my eyes. I was a 23-year-old man, by the way, and I felt like I was cowering, but I was not able to tussle with wood-scratching spirits. Alright, so one night I heard something. Normally, I would have been asleep at this time, but I was up late and heard it. It started on the ceiling on the far side of my room, then it went down the wall, then scratched its way to directly underneath me. After a while, the scratching went across the room and back to the wall, and then was gone. Here's why it's not mice. My walls were solid wood, as the inside log were the same as the outside. The floor had no space between the ceiling below and the floor above. Like I said, it was an old cabin. I got scared and began sleeping downstairs. My roommate, now wife, asked what was up, and I told her. She said the same stuff was going on when she was home alone. This was in the first week. Here's the creepy part. So when we moved in, I had to unscrew all the screws that the previous renters had to put into the windows. I had to unscrew one of the exterior doors that he had screwed shut, and we had to clean out the weird rabbit food from the oven. We had to write "Doesn't live here" on hundreds of mail order catalogues the previous renter received. We always joke that the guy was a shut-in Satanist, but I don't think that we were far off. We both started sleeping downstairs in the living room and felt comfortable in numbers. The eerie feeling was easier to deal with if someone was with you. Until one night, I had a dream that a dark force was approaching me. It was in third person, as if I were watching myself sleep. The entity started looming over my head, and all the while I felt a pressure building in my head and a high-pitched ringing in my ears. It got so intense that I sprung up from my sleep and looked around the room. About a second later, the TV shut off. Just cut off. We'd been having problems with the TV randomly turning on and off, but this time was too far coincidental to be brushed off like everything else. Also, I knew I went to bed with the TV turned off. I cut it off. So why was it on in the first place? We started sleeping in her room after that night. She told me nothing really happened in her room. Maybe because it was an addition. I don't know. Well, our ghosts played matchmaker, and now we're trying for a kid. Married for 5 years. Once I was upstairs reading, and I was falling asleep, and my windows started opening and shutting. I was already at my wit's end with the spirit, so the next day I set up the same situation. Same thing. Funny. Never does it when I'm not there. I ended up yelling to leave us alone, and that I was tired of it. And holy smokes, it kind of worked. For a while anyway. Then when I was home alone, the clock started going off as soon as my wife would leave. The drawers would open and there'd be banging on the front door. Then, over time, it just stopped. Slowed down, ultimately, to nothing. I guess as I matured there, it stopped messing with me. Today my in-laws live there. They were the landlords, and the home is cute, homely, and warm. I spend time there alone and no longer feel any malice. It's a weird experience, and I would do it all over again if I had to. Our third roommate wasn't your typical "I'll get him at night" kind of entity. It didn't matter what time of day it was or who you were. When my windows were open and shutting the first day, it was night, but the second time it happened, it was in the middle of the day. The first ever experience we had was pounding on the door at night, but later, when my alarm clock was going off, it was 9 a.m. on a Saturday. You know, the average time you set your alarm and then pack it into a box in the attic kind of time. If me and my friends were hanging out in the kitchen for a beer, the entity would show itself. Drawers containing silverware and knives would randomly start opening, and trash can top would start rocking at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. I'm not sure why the entity just went away, but it did. In some ways, I don't think the house was haunted at all. Sometimes I think we had strong enough negative energy to bring something in. We drank a lot, pills weren't hard to come by, and neither had any idea where to move forward in life. It was almost if your inner voice of hate manifested into a physical form. As we got healthy, got direction and moved forward, the entity slowly subsided. The cabin is still in my family. My mother-in-law refuses to let it go, and I went from being a 20-something-year-old brat to cleaning the gutters and scheduling specialist repairs for the old house. I love that cabin and where it put me. When my father-in-law passed away, I spent a few hours alone in that cabin hoping for a familiar knock, but I got nothing. When I go there now, there's no sense of doom, only warm welcoming, safety, and comfort. It was as if the entity wasn't trying to haunt us forever, only to be a spiritual nanny, so to speak. And when my wife and I matured, it parted ways. But my story isn't over yet. My mother-in-law has vowed to never let go of the cabin, and it's willed to my wife and her siblings. The ghost always messed with me more than my wife. I guess I had an open port that it could just slip into easier, but we both had experienced things. I've always been more attuned to the paranormal than her. My mother swears she's seen a ghost. You know, the physical embodiment of a person type. My mother's side has always been sensitive. It's not like we ever spoke about it much over the years, but stories did come up. Mostly good stories. I guess I come from a batch of sensitive folk. Don't get me started on the glass breaking. I haven't figured out that one, and I have a couple more unrelated cabin stories too, but maybe those will be for another day. This was back in 2014, but I still remember it like it were yesterday. My grandparents had this cabin that was way up in the mountains. After my grandpa died, my grandma pretty much lived up there since she liked it. I had just finished my second year of college, and my parents and I decided to visit since it had been a while. Now, this was the first time I had stayed there overnight, since we would usually stay at their regular house when we visited. I remember my uncle claimed he saw a ghost when he stayed up there, but I didn't think anything of it because he usually exaggerates and makes things up. I was the only one still awake at around 2 a.m, and I heard what sounded like someone walking around outside. There is gravel all around the cabin, so you could hear footsteps. I initially thought it was an animal, but I decided to look out the window to be safe. I was afraid a person might be out there, because she did have some shady neighbors. I'm looking and saw no one despite hearing something out there. I turned the outside lights on to see better, and again, saw nothing. The footsteps sounded like they stopped right outside the front door. I looked through the peephole on the door and didn't see anything. There were no footprints around either, which was weird because it had rained earlier, and everything was very muddy around the cabin. If something had been waiting around the corner, they wouldn't have had to go through the mud before getting to the gravel. So that's why I figured there would be footprints. Now here's where it gets even creepier. I go into the kitchen to grab a drink, thinking that it must have been an animal when I hear this deep voice. Now it was really low, and I couldn't understand what it was saying. It freaked me out, because I know my dad's voice isn't that low, and neither is my mum or grandma's. I call out, "What?" and the voice stopped. I peek into my grandma's room, because she sometimes listened to the radio at night, but it was off. The TV wasn't on either. I looked all over and find nothing. Needless to say, I didn't sleep that night. I still have no clue what I experienced, but I'm now starting to believe my uncle's ghost story. The footsteps creeped me out more than the voice because it was very slow and sounded like someone was taking their time walking to the door. I also felt like I was being watched too. I didn't like staying there after that night. I sometimes wonder if the ghost of my great-grandfather who built the cabin still resides there. He had a deep voice from what I can remember. The whole experience was very odd, and it still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I have a cabin in the north woods of Minnesota, located about 15 miles inland from Grand Marais, so basically Canada, and about as old of a forest that you can be in. I've been going to this cabin for 22 years. We built it from the ground up with our hands. The front half of our property is without a doubt my family's. However, we have a back lot that is about 10 acres and backs up to the Superior National Forest. I have not done a lot of exploring back there. We mostly use it to preserve the land and to pile trees that fall into the road. I decided to check it out with my wife and dog. I don't know if this next bit is relating to what happened, but it is the first time I have really explored our back lot, and really the only thing that stands out. We started on the road, right at the top of my driveway, and I get our bearing. We walk without incident for about 2 hours. Considering we were bushwalking with a machete, it was pretty grueling work, as anyone who has trailblazed can tell you. We stopped in an area that had what I like to call fairy mounds, not because I believe in fairies, but because it is a pile of dirt or rotted plants that have been completely covered in moss and look super smooth and kind of out of place. They are super bright green, and there are quite a few of them deep in the forest. After the 2 hours of walking, our dog yelps and starts biting at the air around her. We figured she got into a beehive in the ground, so we decided that it was a good time to turn around. I did not see any bees, but my wife did say she saw a couple. As the day progressed, I kept hearing footsteps in our main lot, in the same set of trees on the southwest corner by our well. We have many animals including bears, lynx, wolves and deer, so I dismiss it as nothing, but their hair stands up on end, and I listen to my basic prey instincts and figure it's some sort of predator. Fast forward to that night. I still cannot shake that feeling of being watched by a predator. It's now pitch black out, and our dog keeps trying to go outside, but every time she does, she acts weird and doesn't leave the light circle cast by our floodlights. She keeps begging to be let out. I've seen this before, and it happened to my old dog, when a pack of wolves were on our land trying to lure the dog out to be ganged up. So I lock up the dog door and grab my gun. I cannot reiterate enough just how unsettled I feel. I've been on this land for almost 3 decades. I've slept under the stars, hunted in the trees, and hiked out with a flashlight for miles, because I know the paths so well. This night, however, the forest felt like a stranger. For the first time in my life, I did not feel welcome on my own land. It felt menacing. So I decide to go to bed and just sleep it off, as it's very late. My wife was watching a movie and had a soda after 5 p.m, so like any 30-year-old, she can't sleep yet. Incoming sleep paralysis. I'm laying in bed on my side, my arm under my ear, and I can feel my body start to get heavy. But I can hear my heartbeat in my arm like a drum beat. All of a sudden I realize I can't move at all, and my heart speeds up. I try to wiggle my fingers, and can only get them to wiggle very slightly. And I know for a fact at that moment, I was in sleep paralysis. So I know what this comes with. Paralysis, intruders, waking dreams. Holy shit. I still think about it. I see my dog walk into my room. At least I think it's my dog. I can only see the shadow close to the ground, and I can't turn my head. So I tried to call her name. Coo. I can't make my mouth work. I tried to call her on my bed. Maybe the jostling will wake me up. So I lamely pat my bed with my limp hand. Also a no-go. My heart still beating in my head louder and louder, but it's comforting for some reason. I see my wife walk into the room. She sits on the bed, and I beg her to please wake me up. It comes out so soft I can barely hear myself. I ask for water, but she doesn't move. I try shouting to wake me up, but it comes out no louder than a murmur. As I look at her, I realize I did not feel her actually sit on the bed. I look at her face and realize it's just a shadow. And why hasn't she moved since she got into the room? She is not my wife. Okay, that's weird. Never heard of an intruder being a person before, so I look away, my eyes glancing around the room. I'm frantically wiggling my toes and fingers, trying anything to get my goddamn body to do just one thing I tell it to do. Nothing. My heart sounds like one solid beat now. I look up and see black. In the middle of the room, there is an absolute black circle, a spot in the room devoid of anything. I feel like I'm being pulled into the spot as it keeps getting bigger and bigger. Then all at once, with my heart thundering in my ears, it's over. I regain control of my body. I look around disoriented, and I look down. No dog. I walk out to the living area, and my wife is there. I ask her if the dog came into the room, and she says no. Apparently I was in bed for an hour. I check the clock and it's 3:07. My dog is sleeping on the couch. The feeling is gone. I talk to my wife about it, and she thinks it was just a nightmare created by me freaking myself out. I tell her I think we ran into a wood spirit of some kind, or just a really freaky demon. I still don't know. I've had unexplained things happen to me before, but this one felt so close. I have no description other than that. So this happened when me and my family were on vacation in Pigeon Forge. I was in high school at the time, and we stayed in a 2-story, 2-bedroom cabin in the mountainous wooded area. On the trip we made, my parents, my sister, and my grandfather, who has recently been diagnosed with dementia. The upstairs part of the cabin contained a bedroom and a kitchen/living room, with narrow stairs leading down to a room with a pool table and a couch, and then to the master bedroom. My parents slept in the master bedroom, of course. I slept on the couch in the room with the pool table. My sister slept upstairs on a couch, and my grandfather slept on the other bedroom upstairs. Well, second night there, things start happening. I'm laying on the couch and everyone else is asleep. I'm playing my Game Boy, which has the volume turned all the way down, when I start hearing mumbling coming from across the room. My parents' door is open, so I just brush it off as sound bouncing off the wall and not mention it to anyone. The next night, I again hear the mumbling, so I walk into my parents' bedroom, and both are just watching TV. I ask what they're talking about, to which they reply they weren't, and they were watching Family Guy when it happened, so it wasn't like I was hearing the TV. So I go back in, sit down, and I hear a pool ball roll across the table. I'm pretty scared, but you know, I'm a man. So I do nothing and eventually fall asleep. Next night, the same thing happens, only a lot more frequently. During the last night there, I'm getting used to hearing noises and pool balls rolling. All of a sudden I hear one of the pool sticks slam into the ground when it was currently laying flat on the center of the table. Then I see this shadow pass in front of the opening in front of my mum and dad's bedroom. Then I feel this ice-cold, tingly feeling, sensation kind of thing on my ankle. It felt like someone was grabbing my ankle, and I noped right off that couch and into my parents' bedroom. My mum immediately says, "You saw the shadow too then?" And I was like, "Yeah, and I've been hearing all this other stuff." My sister then runs down the stairs because she gets awoken by the commotion. I tell Dad to turn off the TV, and we all hear mumbling and pool balls rolling. Mum makes Dad go upstairs to check if it's Grandpa talking. While he's gone, we continue to hear the mumbling. Dad gets back and says that he was sound asleep. So a few years later, I decided that I wanted to go back to check it out. I tried to book the cabin, but it no longer appears on the website. I think it's been torn down or remodeled. But I know that it once existed. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's cabin video. As always, a huge thank you to my amazing patrons. Your help and support is absolutely invaluable. And if you'd like your name on screen here, you can check out my Patreon to see how that can be done. As I mentioned at the start, competition starting in 3 days over on my Popbase. So why not check it out now to get grips with it and potentially win a Wii U? I've got one and I really like it. And if you've been thinking of getting one, apply, not apply. Just play the game and, in 3 days' time, check it out and try and win. I think it will be an awesome opportunity for all of you guys. And I'll let you guys know in the coming days any additional details. I'm really excited. And as this is a collaboration with 3 or 4 different creators, I think 4. Snarled, Nightmind, Mortismedia, so us, and Mr. Creepypasta. So the 4 of us is a collaboration between the 4 of us. I'd really like it if one of our listeners won. I mean, you guys might listen to all of them, but just try and win. I'm sure we can do it. It would be really good. So anyway, without further ado, I'm gonna remind you that you can send your stories in. Link in the description if you'd like to hear your story on a video. And for now, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.